Hey guys, it's Patrick Hall with Fstoppers.com, and today I thought it would be fun to explore my current workflow for landscape photography. I'm going to be taking an image that I shot right down the road of our marina and going from this to this. Now, as you can see, it's a pretty dramatic change, and I'm going to show you exactly how I did it. So over the years, we've been testing and showing you guys a lot of different software for editing photos. In this video, I'm actually gonna use the workflow that I typically use for a landscape like this. For me, I think that Photoshop is the best software when it comes to taking multiple images and then combining them into one single image. I really don't think any other software does that as well as what Adobe's Photoshop does. But over the years, one thing I've been experimenting with is different plugins that then allow you to give your image a final look. And for this video, the plugin that I'm going to be using is Luminar AI. And one thing that Luminar AI does particularly well, especially with the new version, is that it allows me to see a bunch of different color grades, and it gives me the option to push my image in a direction that I may not have foreseen, and I certainly wouldn't be able to quickly build here in Photoshop without adding a ton of different layers and wasting a bunch of time. So the second half of this video, I'm gonna get into Luminar more specifically and show you how to give your image kind of a final color grade, which is going to create a very different look for this photo. But let's jump into Photoshop, and the first thing I want to do is show you how I've taken these three different images taken at slightly different times of the morning and combined them into one base image that's going to be the foundation for coming up with my final image. So here is the basic composition for the shot that I'm going to be working on today, and I think this is one of my favorite locations to shoot the Palmas del Mar Marina. In the foreground, we have these palm trees. We also have this porch that I'm going to try to either crop out or Photoshop out. And then in the background, we have the tallest point in all of Puerto Rico. This is the El Yunque rainforest. I believe it's the only rainforest on US soil, which is really cool. And if you ever come to Puerto Rico, I would highly recommend taking a day trip from San Juan and doing some of the hikes in there. There's some incredible waterfalls. There's even like waterfall slides that you can go down. Really, really cool. And one of the beautiful things about this community is that is our backdrop. You get to look at that all day. So this shot was taken, I think around 6 in the morning. And as you can see, we already have some really nice light up here in the clouds. If you look at this cloud up here in the top left, you have the first light of sunrise hitting that top cloud. And then everything else has this nice blue wash. This is kind of the blue hour, the period of time right before the sun rises and starts casting hard light into our scene. Now, the second image that I've shot here, this is all taken on a tripod, so every image should, in theory, line up perfectly. This second image is, I've labeled this first light, and if you compare the two, you can see now we're starting to get light on all of the clouds, but then also many of the homes and many of the palm trees are getting light. We also have nice light right here on the jetties, the rocks that protect the marina, and our yacht club also has some nice light on it as well. And these buildings way in the back here, these are different communities. They also have some really nice warm light hitting those buildings as well. If I come to my third image, I've labeled this golden hour, and this is a lot later in the day. If the first image was shot at 6 o'clock, this image might be taken at 6:45. So 45 minutes later, we have a lot of sunlight hitting all of our buildings. We have a lot more sunlight back here on these little hills. And unfortunately, I was hoping as the sun rose that we would get nice light on El Yunque itself and all of this rainforest would be lit up. But for whatever reason, I still can't really figure out why. Maybe it's cloud coverage. The sun never hit this mountain. And I remember looking at it hours later, you know, midday, and there still was never really any defining light on this mountain. So that's the one little thing. Looking back, I wish I could figure out why we couldn't get more contrast in that mountain back there, but I'm gonna go ahead and highlight all of these images and throw them into Photoshop. And as you can see, it's going to open each image in a new tab. What I'm gonna do is hit Shift and click so that I can unlock the blue hour shot. And then I'm gonna hit Shift and unlock so that I can unlock the base layer of my golden hour shot. And now I can just select this, drag it over into this frame, and I'll do that with the blue hour shot too. And now that I have all of my images here, if I line them up perfectly, they should all line up correctly. But if not, what I can do is select by using Shift all three of these layers. I can come up here to Image, And let's go to Auto Align Layer. This is under Edit. And I'm just going to hit Auto and OK. And what this is going to do is it's going to line up all of my images perfectly. This is really useful if you're on a tripod and maybe the image changes just a bit because the wind is maybe hitting your setup, or if you forgot to turn off your vibration reduction. Sometimes each image is going to be just a little bit off pixel by pixel. If I now turn these on and off, you can see these are all perfectly aligned. Now we do have some differences with the trees in the foreground, and then of course the palm tree up there in the top right. I'm gonna go ahead and relabel these. Let's do blue hour. Second image is golden hour, and then our base layer is going to be first light. So the first thing that I'm gonna do is I'm gonna reorganize these so that the blue hour is my base layer. And my thought process here is that this has some of the most pretty colors. You have all these nice purples and blues. I really love the vibe of this. And so I think that's going to be the image that all of the other images stack on top of. And then maybe I will put the first light right above that. And then the brightest light, the golden hour, is going to be on top. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to turn off the layer of golden hour. And now I'm going to select my first light, and I'm going to come down here and click this little layer mask. That's going to add this white mask right on the right of it. And if I fill this in with the black paint bucket, it is now completely hidden layer 2 or first light. If I hit the shift button and then click my mask, I can turn it on and off. It's going to show that little X when it's not shown. And basically what I'm looking for, as I turn these layers on and off, I'm looking for elements that I like in the brighter image that I can brush in and reveal in my blue hour image. So some of the things I'm looking at, I like how this building here on the left is glowing. I also love all of this nice warm light on the yacht club. The light on all of the rocks here, the jetties, that looks really nice. The beach down here, like this foreground element, is really strong. I think it shows the, the nice orange and brown sand. And finally, these buildings here in the background, I think it's really nice to have that warm light on the edge of Palmas del Mar that kind of like shows you that this is an entire community and really showcases those homes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit shift and click on my layer mask. That's going to hide everything. And now with a white brush, if I paint on this top layer, you can see I can reveal parts of the image that are now in our first light. I have a hard brush here, so it's got a really hard edge. I'm going to hit Control Z to remove that. I'm going to come up here to my brush tool and I'm going to bring the hardness all the way down to 0. If you used a Wacom tablet or something, you could do all of that without having to come up here, but I am old school and still use a mouse. I just feel more comfortable with that. And basically, I'm just going to slowly paint in some of those highlights that I really liked from my first light image. Can probably paint in all of the marina right here. Now, one thing you do want to take notice of if you have anything that moves in your frame, like these boats, if I don't paint them in entirely, I'm going to come up here to flow and just drop this down to 50%. See how if I paint these in at 50%, I'm now getting a lot of blur on these boats. It's almost like a multiple exposure. I don't want that. So what I want to do is instead, I want to make sure that I have my flow and my opacity to 100%. I want to paint those in entirely. And if I have to have a little bit of motion blur caused by the subjects in the frame, I'd rather it be out here in the ocean and not on any kind of sharp object like a boat. So I'm just going to paint all of this in. You can also paint in some of these trees just a little bit. I think with the trees, you're going to have a similar problem that you would have with the boats, but I don't think anyone's going to notice with the foliage being a little blurred, where they might notice that with some of the buildings. So I'm going to add some warm light up here. This house right here really bothers me because there's actually hurricane boards on it still somehow. And of course this little patio right here bothers me too. So I think what I'm going to do towards the end is actually crop in to remove a lot of this left side of the frame. But before I do that, I want to make sure that I get this base image looking as good as possible so that if I change my crop, I don't have pixels outside of the crop that I haven't manipulated at this very first step. Let me come up here and just paint in this little beach and add these highlights on these buildings. And if you start to get some weird little haloing, you can get in here and really be particular so that you don't have some strange highlights that blend in. And for some of these little rolling hills here, if you want, you can come up to flow and just drop this down to like 40 or 50%. And that's going to allow you to paint in a little bit more detail, but it's going to be a lot more subtle instead of using 100% opacity. So what I like to do is sometimes just stop and click my first light layer on and off and see if I'm liking the effect. I might want to paint in this water right here. I think that's kind of looking a little too different. Now I can also hit Shift and turn my layer mask off, and that's going to allow me to see all of the first light image, and then that gives me an idea of what else I might want to paint in. I definitely want to paint more of this beach. I'm going to come down to flow, set that to about 40, and just slowly paint in some of that beach. And one artistic decision that I need to make here is, do I like the light on all of these plants in the foreground? I do think it looks really directional and nice, but it also brings more attention to those plants. And I think I want to have all of the attention go towards the marina. So I might brush in just a little bit here just to kind of give it some more detail. But I'm not going to go too crazy because I don't want your eyes to go to all of this foliage here. As I turn this on and off, I definitely like the highlight on these palms, so I am going to paint in all of this. And this is where you have to really be particular because this is right in the foreground. I don't want it to be too blurry, so I'm probably going to reveal most of this area. And if you go in this little circle motion with a light brush, you can really paint it in nicely to where it doesn't stand out too much. We're basically just trying to feather in some of that nice light. Okay, so I think you get the basic idea. I'm pretty happy with this. Let's go up to our third layer and let's look at golden hour. And what golden hour is going to do is it's just bringing in even more detail into those highlights. There are some really small details that I like. I think, you know, the marina, if we zoom in here, when the golden hour light hits, it kind of illuminates this one room right here on the left. I think, even though it's really small in the frame, I think those highlights are really nice. So I'm gonna come up here, I'm gonna add another layer mask. I'm gonna paint this black with my bucket tool. I'm gonna go back to my paintbrush, change it to white by hitting X. And then here, I'm just going to lighten up some of these little details on this building. In some ways, the yacht club right here is kind of my subject. So if I was going to introduce any more highlights, it definitely would be to this building. If you hit Alt and then select your layer mask, you can see what you're revealing and what you're not revealing. And then if I hit Shift, it turns it back on and off. Maybe I can add just a little bit more of these highlights in the rocks here. Clean up the shoreline, give that just a little bit more pop. And there's another spray right there that's pretty cool. Now, as I'm looking at these buildings back here, this is the Solaria community. I think I like the purple, softer first lighting on the buildings more than I like the golden hour. I think if I reveal the golden hour, yes, it will be brighter, but it's also going to be the wrong color. It's going to be yellow. So I don't think I want to introduce too much of that light into the background there. So that looks pretty good. So I barely used any of the golden hour. I'm going to turn that on and off. You can see it's just adding a little bit more detail and highlights, especially here in the middle of the frame, where I hope all of your attention goes. And then really a lot of it is just the first light. It's adding just a little bit of first light to my blue hour shot. And this is all taste. This is all personal preference, but you can see how powerful it is taking 3 different images, stacking them on top of each other, and then just revealing the little parts that you want to show. Imagine if there was a boat coming in and out of the marina, I could easily add or remove that just by selecting that one frame. There's a lot that you can do with this technique, and I think this is one of the most important aspects for landscape photography if you want to get those images that look like so many of the contemporary photographers you've probably seen on Instagram. Now, the next thing that I want to do is I want to give this a look. This image I've shot and I've edited this in a pretty straightforward way. We've added highlights by using some of the different exposures, but for the most part, this image is kind of just straight out of camera. It looks really flat. A lot of times I like to look at this little thumbnail up here, or you can shrink the image and make it smaller. And to me, it just doesn't pop quite well enough. So this is where Luminar AI comes in. With Luminar AI, I'm gonna be able to quickly put a bunch of filters and looks over my image, and it's going to push me in a direction that maybe I'm not considering at the moment. So the first thing I wanna do is I wanna hit Shift, Control, Alt, E. I know that's a lot of buttons, but when you do that, it's going to flatten the layers from below, and it's gonna give me one single layer on top. This is gonna act as a single file that we can then open in Luminar. Now, I have Luminar installed on this computer both as a standalone program, so if you don't wanna use Photoshop, you might have a harder time blending all of these images together, but you definitely can use Luminar AI as a standalone program if you're somebody who just wants one piece of software. If you don't wanna subscribe to Photoshop, I totally understand that, but I like using both programs in tangent. So what I can do is come up here to Filter. I can go all the way down to Skylum Software and then Luminar AI. And now we're gonna take that 3-image blend and then throw it into Luminar and see if we can now manipulate the colors and add some of their special effects using artificial intelligence to produce one final image that really jumps off the screen. All right, so this is what Luminar AI looks like. Now, one of the new features that Luminar AI has implemented in the software is their templates. Basically, what these templates are is they're just recipes to get to a final outcome. You can tweak them, you can save these tweaked recipes as your own. You can also download other ones if you have a famous photographer that you follow and you want to get that specific look, you can download their templates. This is really handy in giving you a basic idea of where your image can go, and I use these all the time. I find the most difficult part about photography is not just capturing and creating the best image, but then figuring out what the final tonal look is going to be. I struggle with that, maybe you do too. Software like this really, really helps. Now, these templates also can use artificial intelligence to immediately figure out the starting point. So this is obviously a landscape, but if we had a person in this image, maybe the templates would recommend something that's more portrait oriented. For this image, you can see they've chosen easy landscapes. It already knows that this image is a landscape. If I come down here to long exposure, this is a little cartoony. This is probably a little over the top, but we can also control how much of this effect is on our final image. So if I slide this all the way down, it's turning the effect off entirely. If I slide it all the way to the right, it's using 100% of the effect. Something like that is a little too extreme for me. So maybe if we pull it down 50%, that's starting to look a little bit more normal. Let's come down to sunset. This is adding a lot of yellows and oranges into our scene. Here's a black and white Norscape, forest stream. Snowfall is a very desaturated look. You can see just how different all of these are, and this is just under the easy landscape collection. I'm gonna go back to templates, and one of them that I thought I liked a lot was under overcast. And this is pretty wild. If I come down to night's thunder, you can instantly see that my sky changed, and you're probably thinking, what in the world is going on here? This has made the image almost look like it was shot under moonlight, but then they have the sky replacement selected on this template, and it's picking a completely different sky. So that's pretty cool. You've seen a lot of videos of us doing sky replacements. I may not get into that with this image only because I feel like my sky actually looks pretty good. But some of these templates do utilize those AI features to where it's changing the sky as well. So you could use that to your advantage, especially if you have an image that has a really blue sky with no interest at all. The template I wound up really thinking fits this image the most is under big city lights, and this is street theater. If I turn this on and off, you can see it's very extreme, but what I like about this is the detail that it is bringing out in my foreground, and it's adding like a sharpening effect and a micro contrast that takes an image that looks pretty flat and dull, but is a good base image, and it's giving it a lot of punch. Now, obviously this is way too strong, so I'm gonna come down here and I'm gonna pull this all the way down to maybe like 40%. And now if we look at it, I feel like it's giving me that effect that I enjoyed without making it too over the top. So I think somewhere right around 30% looks really nice. Now, if you've designed your own templates or you find one like this that you love and you think you're done, you could just hit apply and it's gonna take you back into Photoshop. I'm gonna come up here to edit, and I'm gonna look at some of the effects that they've used in this template and maybe tweak those a little bit. And then finally, I might look at some of these other modules and see if there's an effect that I wanna add to this recipe that's not already there that might make this look a little bit more like my style. Enhance AI is probably one of the most powerful tools in Luminar AI, and you would probably be like me and you'd probably be pretty skeptical and say there's no way that one or two sliders can just magically make an image pop. But if I turn this on and off, you can see a lot of the heavy lifting of this effect is done with this accent AI. The sky enhancer, if we turn this up, you can see it's only affecting the sky, which is pretty cool. It's like there's a gradient built in that knows only to affect the top part of this image. That has added a little bit too much color, in my opinion. But if we pull it down kind of where it was to the 20s, I think it really is adding a nice effect. If we come down to light, this is very similar to something like Lightroom or Camera Raw, where you can change the exposure and the temperature and all of that. We can make the image a little bluer or warmer. I'm gonna double click and just keep it as it was shot. Now, color, I've always said, is one of the most important editing tools for any image, no matter what piece of software you're in. But let me click on color, and then let me come down here to highlights, saturation, and luminosity. And here is where you can really see the magic in this software. Hue, nothing has really been changed here, but if we come down to saturation, part of the recipe of this template is pulling down the oranges and the yellows just a little bit. And then if we come down to luminance, this recipe has everything set to 0, but if there's something in this image that's bothering me, say I feel like the clouds have just a little bit too much magenta or purple in them, I can come in here and start tweaking what these clouds look like. And maybe lifting the purple up a little bit takes away some of the drama in the sky and makes it look just a little bit more natural. And as I scroll through here, one way to know which one of these modules is part of the recipe is these little dots that are next to the different modules. Now, if I click on mood, you can see that this one has been used in this street theater edit. And this is basically like a LUT. You can come in here and you can just scroll through all of these and it's gonna give you kind of a film look. I mean, this almost looks like a cross-processed magentas in the shadows look. Color punch hot, this gives it kind of a retro look as well. And you can fine tune almost like a film stock, which is going to give this image a little bit more of a natural feel, especially since we've blended in 3 different digital files. Sometimes those really start to look sterile. Adding a LUT or a film grain like this can help bring everything together and make it feel a little bit more cohesive. If you feel like your digital files are just too sharp and everything, again, kind of has that super sterile, you know, precision look to it, one thing that I've used a lot is Mystical, and if I turn this all the way up to 100%, it's adding like a slight blur to the whole image. This would be really good for like portraits or something like that. I think at 100%, it's way too much on this landscape. But if I bring it down to maybe just 7, it's adding just the slightest little blurring effect that kind of makes the image feel a little bit more organic instead of being this super sharp digital file. So I'm gonna go ahead and leave that on. And another tool that I find myself using a lot is this film grain. Now I know if you zoom into this 100%, we spend so much time trying to get the lowest ISO and we don't want any kind of digital noise whatsoever, but sometimes adding a little bit of noise, especially if you're compositing multiple images and you start looking in the shadows, you'll see areas that have zero noise, and then you might see a little bit more noise and it's not blended in perfectly. Adding a film grain over the entire image can help bring all of that together so that if you start pixel peeping on a really high megapixel image, the grain is going to be consistent. I use this a lot in my commercial work. So I'm going to come down to film grain and let's go up to like 30. And I think with an image that's this busy, the only area that you're going to see the film grain is up here in these shadows on the mountains. Usually the film grain is much more prevalent in your shadow areas. So when you're toggling this on and off, you're going to want to look to see, is it adding too much noise? You want to find that nice balance point where it feels organic and it feels like it's bringing all of files together in a cohesive way and not just adding arbitrary noise where you don't really need noise. So something really subtle like this is good. If you find that you have noise in an area that you don't want, you can also come here to add layer mask, and then I can come up to the eraser tool over here, and then I can just erase out the noise in that particular part of the image. That's also really, really helpful. I'm gonna go back a step because I want that grain to be consistent over the entire image. Now, so far I've just played around with the essentials and the creative tabs. We also have the sky replacement and the atmosphere, which can add kind of smoke and clouds into your image. That's incredibly powerful as well. You also have the sun rays, where if you have the sun in your frame, but you've never really captured the right sun rays, there was no mist in the atmosphere, you might want to add that to your image. I'm not going to do that for this photograph, but I do want to talk quickly about portrait because obviously there's no people in this image. If you want to start cleaning up skin or shrinking the body and doing all these really crazy things with your portrait work, Luminar AI is pretty crazy with that. I mean, I can go back into Photoshop and I can go to the liquefy tool and I can be very, very precise and spend minutes or hours massaging all of the parts of someone's body to try to get it the shape that I want. Or you can just come down here to body AI and you can shrink their body really quickly, and it kind of gets you in the ballpark. It's not as precise as what you can do in Photoshop. I don't think anyone's going to tell you otherwise. But if you're just trying to post something to Instagram and you just want to thin somebody down just a little bit, these portrait AI modules are really, really powerful for that as well. The fourth category that I do want to talk about, because I'm going to use that in this image, is the professional one. You can go to optics and you can get rid of defringing and vignetting and all that sort of stuff. We also have dodge and burn and color harmony. The one that I want to use for this image is super contrast. So I'm going to zoom out just a little bit. And what this is going to let me do is control the contrast in my highlights, midtones, and shadows separately. This is extremely useful for something like this with a landscape that has a ton of dynamic range. I'm going to go ahead and bump up my contrast all the way up for the highlights. Let me toggle this on and off. And you can see what it's doing here. It's bringing back some of these really subtle tones, these pinks and these oranges that are behind the clouds. I think that looks better. And if I bump the mid-tone contrast up, you can see it's really saturating all the colors and it's making this look kind of cartoony. And I think this is a good reason why something like this super contrast module works so well, is that without playing with the midtones, I can add contrast just in the highlights and stay away from the midtones, which is giving me that cartoony look. I definitely don't want to do that. And similarly, I feel like if I bring the shadow contrast up on this image, it's almost starting to make this feel like that fake HDR, and I definitely don't want that either. I don't think that's a look anyone wants to go with. So I'm going to bring the shadow contrast down, maybe just add just the slightest little bit. Really, I'm using super contrast just to give a little bit more definition in my sky. And as you can see, in the lower part of this image, it's super subtle, but in the top part of the image where all the highlights are, I think it's adding a little bit more detail and it's just making that sky look just a little bit nicer. Now, the last thing that I always do with an effect like this, whether I do it in Photoshop or I do it in Luminar, is I usually reevaluate how much of that overall effect I've applied to the image globally, because over time, I find that for me personally, I get a little heavy-handed with this, and a lot of times I want to pull everything back. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back down to my street theater, and now it says edited because I've made my own changes to this template. I might pull this down from 30% and just go maybe to 25%. Just lower it just a little bit And what that's gonna do is it's just gonna make everything a little bit more subdued and kind of fix my heavy-handedness in this edit. So now I'm gonna hit apply. Luminar is gonna export this image back into Photoshop. And now this new layer, I'm going to type Luminar AI, and that is the final look that I have. I can toggle this on and off, and you can see what it's done. It's added a lot of contrast down here in the foreground. Let me zoom in just a little bit so you can really see this. I feel like it gives a lot more detail to all of the foliage. Let's come up here to our clouds. It's almost like this image has that like straight out of camera raw look where it's super flat, and then this gave it just the littlest punch that it needs. Another technique that you could use is instead of decreasing the effect in Luminar, if you do use Photoshop and Luminar together like I do, you might want to go a little heavy-handed on the coloring in Luminar, knowing that you can lower it a little bit here. If there's an area that I might want to increase it, I can't increase it any more than 100%. So I know I've done that in the past too, where I've imported the Luminar edit that's a little bit more saturated and a little bit heavier of an effect, knowing that I can then bring it down here in Photoshop. The final thing that I want to do is I feel like this palm tree is distracting, and of course I don't like this little gate here. So I'm going to come up to my crop tool. I've been doing a lot of 16:9 crops. I think this looks a little bit more cinematic, and I feel like in an image like this, I don't necessarily want to show off all the foreground, and the top of the sky gets a little boring. And I think I'm going to crop in pretty considerably. This was shot on a 24-70 lens, and looking back, I think I wanted to shoot this image past 70 millimeters. I think for me, this marina is really the subject matter here. So what I want to do is just crop in really tight and make it all about the marina, and kind of get rid of all of the extra material that's not focusing your attention right into the middle of this frame. So something like that looks pretty good. Let's hit OK. There we go. There's our final image. I think this turned out great. While it's not my absolute favorite landscape shot I've ever taken, I think this is one of the most beautiful locations for this neighborhood. Maybe shooting something from a drone just a little bit higher could kind of open up the scene so that these palm trees in the foreground don't block all of the water. That's the one thing that kind of drives me crazy about this image. But if you need to be on land with a tripod and you want to shoot through multiple lighting events, this is probably the best place. And I think soon they're building houses right where this camera is, so you're not going to be able to take this image much longer. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I know it's kind of long, but I just wanted to outline kind of my basic workflow that I use on my landscape images, especially when I want to blend in moments of time, kind of like Elia Liccardi does, and then I want to give my images a final look. Now, as I turn this on and off, I know you're probably thinking this image isn't all that different from the image that we started with, but in many cases, especially my commercial work, or if you're doing stuff for Instagram where you want to give your images a very wildly different look than the normal colors that are coming out of your camera, I think that's where you're going to find software like Luminar to be very powerful, because you could find a desaturated look or a cross-process look that you probably, at least for me, I wouldn't be able to come up with on my own here in Photoshop without trying to run through a bunch of filters that I'm just making haphazardly. So if you want to get your own copy of Luminar, head over to the description in the link below. I believe it's about $99 to get a license to use forever for 2 computers. If you're like me, I like to have this on both my laptop and my desktop. If you just need 1 license for 1 computer, you can knock it down even more. I believe it's about $79, which is pretty affordable. Buy it one time and then use it forever. They also give you updates every now and then so that you can update the AI modules and everything so that it's all running as well as possible. If you guys want to check out our full length tutorials, head over to fstoppers.com/store, where we've teamed up with some incredible photographers like Elia Liccardi, who taught me most of these techniques. He's also a Luminar user. You can also head over to fstoppers.com to check out our free daily content. And if you like these videos, make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel and hit the bell below so that you're notified when we have a brand new video. I will see you guys very soon.